Hey everyone, I hope you're all having an incredible day. Today, I've got a story that's going to completely change the way you think about leadership. Imagine running a successful trucking company, believing everything is under control, until you realize your employees are exhausted, overworked, and pushed beyond their limits. Instead of ignoring the problem, this CEO goes undercover as a driver to see the truth for himself. What he discovers is shocking, but what he does next, that's where the real lesson begins. Stick around, because this is a story of transformation, accountability, and what it really means to lead. David Lawson sat in his spacious corner office at FleetGo Transit headquarters, staring at the latest operational reports on his screen. The numbers weren't just bad, they were alarming. Delivery delays had skyrocketed, driver complaints were piling up, and customer satisfaction was at an all-time low. The reports detailed packages arriving damaged, customers waiting hours past their delivery windows, and worst of all, drivers quitting in record numbers. His regional managers had explanations for everything, blaming supply chain disruptions, increased demand, and inexperienced new hires. But to David, those sounded like excuses. His company had started with just one truck and a promise of efficiency and reliability. Now, he feared that promise had been broken. The tipping point came when he received an email from a longtime customer detailing a disturbing incident. They had spotted one of his drivers asleep in his van at a gas station, engine still running. Another complaint followed. A neighbor's security camera had captured a FleetGo driver carelessly tossing a fragile package onto a porch. David clenched his jaw. This wasn't the company he had built. It wasn't just about late deliveries anymore. His employees were overworked, exhausted, and cutting corners to survive their brutal schedules. Something had gone deeply wrong, and no amount of corporate reports or polished explanations could tell him why. David made a decision. He needed to see it for himself. Not from behind a desk, but from the front lines. He would go undercover as a rookie driver, experience the reality firsthand, and uncover the truth. Only then could he fix what was broken. With a deep breath, he reached for his phone. "Cancel my meetings for the week," he told his assistant. "I've got work to do. Real work." Dressed in faded jeans, a worn-out jacket, and steel-toed boots, David Lawson stepped into the FleetGo Transit warehouse as Dan Lewis, a newly hired driver trainee. His neatly trimmed beard was replaced with a scruffy 5 o'clock shadow, and a pair of thick-rimmed glasses helped disguise his face. With over 500 employees spread across multiple hubs, it was easy to blend in. None of the workers had ever met the CEO in person. As he entered the break room, the scent of burnt coffee and motor oil filled the air, and the low hum of conversation was laced with exhaustion. Drivers slouched at plastic tables, gulping down caffeine before their grueling shifts, their eyes heavy from lack of sleep. A clipboard thudded onto the table in front of him. "Dan, right? You're with me," muttered Frank Miller, a wiry man in his late 40s with deep lines etched into his face. He barely glanced at David before tossing him a handheld scanner. "Keep up. We don't have time for screw-ups. No introductions, no formal training, just urgency." David followed Frank through the bustling loading dock, where workers hustled to stack packages onto the waiting trucks. The energy was frantic, not the smooth, efficient process FleetGo had been known for. As they reached their truck, Frank muttered, "Hope you like long hours, newbie. Dispatch keeps squeezing in more stops, and if you fall behind, well, let's just say you don't want to find out." David tightened his grip on the scanner, already sensing that he was about to witness the real problem firsthand. As the truck rumbled out of the warehouse, David Lawson, still undercover as Dan Lewis, immediately sensed the strain of the job. The route was packed, with over 150 stops scheduled for the day, far more than what seemed reasonable. Frank, his assigned trainer, drove with an almost robotic efficiency, weaving through traffic while juggling the dispatch system's constant alerts. The moment they hit their first delivery, David realized just how relentless the workload truly was. "No time for chit-chat," Frank grumbled, as he yanked a heavy package from the truck and dropped it onto the customer's doorstep without knocking. Before David could process it, Frank was already back behind the wheel. "Scan it, move on." There was no time for proper service, no regard for ensuring packages were handled with care, just speed, pressure, and exhaustion. As they moved through the morning stops, David noticed the fatigue written all over Frank's face. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements rushed, but sluggish at the same time, as if his body was pushing past its limits. At a red light, Frank rubbed his temples and muttered, "Third double shift this week. Dispatch don't care, they just keep piling it on." When David asked if he had requested a break, Frank scoffed. "Yeah, and my reward for that? Fewer hours next week. I need the money, man." The afternoon only made things worse. At one stop, a frustrated customer confronted them, angry about a damaged package. "This is the second time this has happened," she snapped. Frank barely looked at her, muttering a half-hearted "call customer service" before walking away. David saw the exasperation in the woman's face. This wasn't just a one-time issue, it was systemic. But the real gut punch came just before their last set of deliveries. A loud thud sounded from the truck behind them. David turned in time to see a young driver collapse onto the pavement. Frank cursed, dropping his scanner. "Damn it, not again." David's stomach twisted. If this was a common occurrence, something was deeply wrong at Fleetgo, and he had just scratched the surface. The moment David Lawson saw the young driver collapse, everything around him seemed to slow. The sound of packages shifting inside the truck, the beeping of a reversing vehicle in the distance. It all faded into the background as he sprinted toward the fallen worker. The young man, barely in his 20s, lay motionless on the hot pavement, his uniform soaked in sweat, his breathing shallow. Frank cursed under his breath, but didn't look surprised. "Damn it, not another one," he muttered, already pulling out his phone. David dropped to his knees beside the driver. "Hey, can you hear me?" he called, gently shaking the man's shoulder. No response. His pulse was weak, his skin pale. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was complete physical shutdown. Around them, other workers began to gather, some glancing at the scene with unease but no real urgency. It was clear this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Before David could react further, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Rick Dawson, the warehouse manager, stomped toward them, clipboard in hand, his face twisted in irritation rather than concern. "What the hell is going on here?" he barked, barely glancing at the collapsed driver before directing his glare at Frank. Frank sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's Kyle. Kid's been pulling doubles all week. Guess he finally hit his limit." Rick groaned in exasperation. "Unbelievable. Call an ambulance if you have to. But I need this route finished. We're already behind." David's fists clenched. Behind? A man was lying unconscious on the ground, and all Rick cared about was keeping deliveries on schedule. "He needs medical attention," David said, his voice sharp. Rick turned to him, eyes narrowing. "And who the hell are you to tell me how to run my site?" Before David could respond, another worker finally had the sense to call 911. The tension in the air was suffocating. Kyle was loaded into the ambulance within minutes, but the atmosphere at the depot didn't change. There was no shock, no outrage, just resignation. Workers shook their heads, muttered something about another one down, and returned to their routes. No one expected things to change. David stood frozen, watching the ambulance disappear down the road. Kyle could have died, and no one seemed to care. If this was the standard at Fleetgo, it was no longer just a failing company. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And he wasn't going to stand by and watch. David Lawson had seen enough. The moment Kyle was rushed to the hospital, he knew he could no longer stay silent. This wasn't just a tough job. This was a system designed to break people. Drivers weren't just overworked, they were afraid. Afraid to speak up, afraid to take a break, afraid that if they couldn't keep up, they'd be tossed aside like broken-down trucks. And at the center of it all was Rick Dawson. That evening, David lingered near the break room, listening as workers exchanged quiet, bitter remarks over stale coffee. "They don't care if we drop dead as long as the packages get there. I asked for a day off last week. Rick cut my hours instead. If you complain, you get the worst routes. If you break down, it's your problem." The more he heard, the angrier he became. These weren't complaints. This was survival. When Rick finally emerged from his office, barking orders about picking up the slack, David stepped forward. "We need to talk, now." Rick sneered. "What's this about, new guy? You want a day off already?" David didn't flinch. "It's about Kyle, and everyone else here busting their backs while you sit in that office pretending not to see what's happening." The break room fell silent. Workers stopped mid-sip, eyes darting between them. No one ever called Rick out. Rick's smirk faded. Listen, rookie, you think you know how this works? You don't. These guys signed up for the job. If they can't handle it, they can leave. David took a step closer. And if someone dies on your watch? For the first time, Rick hesitated. But before he could respond, David knew this wasn't just bad management. This was a culture of fear. And it was about to end. The next morning, David Lawson walked into the trucking depot. But this time, he wasn't hiding behind his disguise. Gone were the worn-out jeans and faded hoodie. He was back in his usual sharp blazer, standing tall as the CEO of Lawson Freight. The room went silent as drivers, warehouse workers, and dispatchers stared, realization dawning on their faces. The new guy wasn't just another rookie. He was the man who owned the company. Rick Dawson, the depot manager, stepped out of his office, mid-yawn, coffee in hand. He barely had time to register what was happening before David locked eyes with him. Rick, we need to talk. Rick hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. Wait, what? What's going on? David's voice was cold, controlled, but firm. I spent the past few days working under you. I saw everything. The way you ignored safety concerns, how you treated your drivers like machines, how you dismissed Kyle when he collapsed. You've been running this depot into the ground. A murmur spread through the room. Drivers exchanged looks, some shocked, others hopeful. They had spent years believing no one in corporate cared, that they were just numbers. But now, their CEO had seen the truth with his own eyes. Rick scoffed, trying to regain control. Look, I was just following company expectations. You want deliveries made, right? This is how it works. David took a step forward. No, this is how you made it work. And it ends today. Silence. Then David turned to the employees. Rick Dawson is no longer your manager. Effective immediately, he's fired. A collective hush fell over the room before someone exhaled sharply. Then, Rick's face turned red. You can't be serious. Get your things and leave, Rick, David cut in, his voice final. As security escorted Rick out, David turned back to his team. We're not just fixing this depot, we're fixing this company. And it starts now. With Rick Dawson gone, David Lawson wasted no time setting things right. Standing in the center of the trucking depot, he looked around at the exhausted drivers and warehouse workers, their faces a mixture of shock and cautious hope. I know words mean nothing if they aren't backed by action, he said, his voice firm yet understanding. So, here's what's going to change, starting today. The first issue he tackled was the brutal work schedules. Mandatory breaks were now non-negotiable. No more skipping meals or driving dangerously long hours just to meet impossible quotas. He made it clear that if a driver needed rest, they would get it without fear of punishment. A new digital scheduling system would be installed to track hours properly, preventing dispatchers from forcing drivers into unsafe overtime. Next, he addressed equipment failures. No more unsafe trucks on the road, he declared. He had already contacted corporate to authorize immediate inspections for the entire fleet. Any truck flagged as unsafe would be pulled from rotation until properly serviced, no exceptions. Drivers who reported vehicle issues would no longer be ignored or penalized. Instead, a direct hotline to corporate was established, allowing employees to bypass local management if concerns weren't addressed. Then came the issue of driver workload. David called over Lewis, the veteran driver who had helped him the most. Lewis, you've been here long enough to know what's reasonable and what isn't. Starting now, I want you to work with me to restructure these routes. No more overloading drivers to the point of collapse. Lewis, still wary but clearly intrigued, gave a slow nod. Finally, David turned to the employees. I want to hear from you. What else needs to change? A moment of silence followed, until Sam, a dispatcher, cautiously raised her hand. Respect, she said simply. David nodded. Then we start there. It wasn't going to be an overnight fix, but for the first time in years, the employees felt heard. And for David, this was just the beginning of rebuilding Lawson Freight the right way. With immediate changes in place at the trucking depot, David Lawson knew that fixing one location wasn't enough. He had to rebuild the entire company from the ground up. The toxic culture he uncovered wasn't an isolated issue. It was a symptom of deeper, systemic problems that had been ignored for too long. If Lawson Freight was going to survive, it needed more than quick fixes. It needed lasting reform. David's first step was to overhaul leadership training. He implemented a mandatory leadership program for all depot managers and supervisors, focusing on employee well-being, crisis management, and ethical decision-making. "You're not here to push people past their limits," he told them during the first training session. "You're here to make sure they succeed." Any manager who refused to adapt was replaced. There would be no room for leadership that thrived on intimidation. Next, he tackled the workload crisis. He hired additional drivers and warehouse staff to ease the burden, ensuring that no employee was forced into unsafe working hours just to keep operations running. He also introduced a new scheduling system that prioritized efficiency without sacrificing driver health. Overtime would now be voluntary, never forced, and anyone reporting unsafe conditions would be protected from retaliation. David also knew that open communication was key to maintaining these changes. He launched an anonymous feedback system where employees could report concerns directly to corporate, bypassing local management if necessary. He personally read through these reports every week, making sure no issue was left unaddressed. "You're not just numbers on a spreadsheet," he told his employees. "You're the reason this company exists, and I won't forget that again." Within months, the results spoke for themselves. Turnover rates dropped, morale improved, and customers began noticing better service. Employees, once afraid to speak up, now felt valued. David had built Lawson Freight to be a company people could be proud of, and after nearly losing sight of that, he was determined to never let it happen again. With the reforms in place, Lawson Freight was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. The toxic environment that had once drained its workers had been replaced with a culture of respect, fairness, and accountability. The changes weren't just policies on paper, they were real, tangible improvements that drivers and warehouse workers could feel every day. David Lawson made sure to stay involved, visiting different hubs regularly, not as a CEO handing down orders, but as a leader listening to his people. On one such visit, he saw something that told him the company had truly turned a corner. A new driver, fresh out of training, was struggling with his first solo shift. Instead of being mocked or ignored, one of the veteran drivers, someone who had once kept his head down in fear, stepped in to help him. It was a small moment, but to David, it meant everything. The culture of fear had been replaced with one of support. At the warehouses, workers now took their scheduled breaks without the fear of being penalized. The new safety policies had led to a drastic reduction in on-the-job injuries, and for the first time in years, employees weren't burning out within months of being hired. Even customers began to notice the change, praising drivers for their professionalism and better service. One afternoon, David found himself standing in the loading dock, watching as drivers laughed and exchanged stories before heading out for their shifts. He thought back to the moment he had first stepped into the warehouse undercover, seeing exhaustion and hopelessness in his workers' eyes. Now, there was life again. He had nearly lost sight of what mattered, but this experience had changed everything. Lawson Freight was finally back on the right track, and this time, it was built to last. The biggest lesson from David Lawson's undercover journey was that leadership isn't about sitting in an office. It's about understanding and supporting the people who keep a company running. He had built Lawson Freight with a vision of fairness and efficiency, but somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with the reality his employees faced. His company's success was coming at the cost of its workers' well-being, and no spreadsheet or management report could have shown him that truth. By stepping into their world, David saw firsthand how toxic leadership, impossible expectations, and disregard for employee welfare had nearly broken his workforce. He learned that efficiency should never come at the expense of human dignity, and that when employees feel valued, they perform better, not out of fear, but because they believe in their work. This experience transformed his leadership. He realized that real change doesn't happen through policy memos. It happens through action, accountability, and listening. A thriving company isn't just about profit margins. It's about the people behind the wheel, in the warehouses and on the ground. And as a leader, his most important job wasn't just running the company, it was making sure his people could thrive within it.